Hello and welcome to another broadcast of Truth Be Told, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and in studio we have your other host, the one and only Captain Ron. There are historical figures that are timeless, and today we are going to talk about one of those historical figures, the billionaire Howard Hughes. His eccentric life has led to many mysteries and secrets that will hopefully be answered today, because we have two authors of a very intriguing book titled Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes. This book is a second edition of the life, personal stories, additional evidence, and photographs of Hughes, links to the murders of mobster Bugsy Siegel and the killers of President John F. Kennedy. And we have much, much more to talk about with these two authors, so please let me introduce these two insightful authors to Truth Be Told audience, Douglas Wellman and Mark Music. Oh, wow. I didn't know there was an audience. I didn't know the audience was going to be here today.
What applause. Excellent.
Hey, guys. How you doing?
Hiya, Tony. Hiya, Captain Ron.
Hi there, guys.
Well,
very good on this end.
Good. Well, you're a lot drier than we are. Here in California, we're getting drenched. So torrential. So speaking of torrential, we're excited to have you here because I'm a huge history buff. Any historical figures. And I've always been a fan of Howard Hughes, at least, you know, the craziness that we hear and the accomplishments that he had in his lifetime, and even the movie Aviator, where, you know, Leonardo portrayed him. So a lot of the younger generation got a glimpse of who he was. But you guys have a different story that you want to tell us, but about who he really was. But before we do that, I want to see your interest. How did you guys get interested in Howard Hughes? And, you know, we can start with either one of you guys.
Well, the story begins with Mark, so.
All right, Mark, there you go.
Well, let me start out. I've got a military background, retired Major General in the Air Force, and met a lady in 2002. Her name was Eva McClelland. And she started relaying a story to me, and I thought it was the craziest story that I'd ever heard. It was wild. It didn't bear anything to what I thought was the truth. But nothing ever changed in her story. Nothing modified, no dates, no conversations, no nothing. So I went and started investigating it because I thought, well, I don't know if this is right or not. I went and started investigating it and found out that everything she said could be backed up. And the story was that Howard Hughes, supposedly who died in 1976, did not die in 1976. He was living under an identity provided by the CIA, and he lived another 25 years married to Eva McClelland, hiding away. And Eva kept his secret for those 25 years until he finally passed away in 2001. I met her 2002, and she told me the story.
Okay, now I'm speechless.
As if his life before that wasn't weird enough, right?
Right.
It's like then there's the zinger at the end, you know?
Okay, well, that's the end of the show, so thank you, Notes. So, okay, what did you know much about Howard Hughes at all before that, other than just what you read or saw, you know, as in documentaries or TV programs or...
About all I remember Howard Hughes at that point was he had a strange end of his life, supposedly long-haired, long fingernailed, bedridden, drug-addicted, 90-pound man.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've learned is that was actually a stand-in.
Oh.
Howard had another identity he was using, and he also had a stand-in character from about, we think about 1969 on to his natural death in 1976.
All right, so Douglas or Doug, tell us how you got involved.
Well, I had an interest in Howard Hughes going actually back to the 1950s because I had an uncle who worked for Hughes Aviation and had, you know, told me some things. But I was also a producer and director in Hollywood for a number of years. And back in 1984, I wrote and directed a program about the Howard Hughes Spruce Goose. And through that, I got interested in Hughes himself. And so I did have a fairly large volume of information in my tiny little brain about Hughes. But it was really when a friend of mine who at the time was a active duty Air Force colonel called me and said that he knew a major general who had this very strange story, and could they come out to Los Angeles and meet me and tell me the story. And about a week later, Mark and the colonel walked into my living room, and Mark had an armload of files, and that's where my involvement in this particular story began.
Okay, so
Thank you for saying armload, because I thought he was going to say something else.
right. Yeah, right. So the question is, Mark, you got this information. You know, all of us living in Hollywood, or even family secrets. People tell you, you hear things, and you're like, okay, and then you move on with your life. So what was this need to actually pursue the, I guess, answers to your questions of did it really happen?
Well, my interaction with Eva McClellan is probably the biggest overwhelming factor, because I met with her many, many times. She told me little bits and pieces of this story. And for the first 4 years, I just didn't believe it. I thought it was just lunacy.
Oh, 4 years.
And but the thing I noticed is nothing ever changed in her story. And so I went back and started looking at birth certificates. I went back and started looking at medical records, at military records, all of these things. And she gave me a few documents, and things began to put together. It began to come together, where what she was saying, you could back up. So I went to where they lived. They lived sometime in Arizona. They lived basically in Panama. I didn't go to Panama, but I went back to where they lived, and everything was exactly what she said. Nothing was ever in error of what she described to me of her life with this man. He was using the name of Nick Nickley, was the name he was using, Nick Nickley, but he had a military ID of a retired man named Werner Nicely. And so as we went to put this all back together again, he loved confusion. He loved confusion.
Apparently so.
However, Nick Nickley, who Eva met, was 6'4" tall. He was a tall man, handsome man. Werner Nicely, who the ID he had, was 5'11". So we have a height difference here between these two, a physical difference between these two, but they both had aviation backgrounds. And as we discovered, Werner Nicely, the real Werner Nicely, pretty much disappeared in the late 60s. He was working for the CIA.
Uh-oh.
And he had missions that he was supporting in counter-drug effort in Colombia. And so as we began to put little by little, what I found out was that nothing Eva said was ever in error. Nothing she said was ever false. Everything she said was exactly true. We put the first book out in 2010. And as we've now 6 years later, we found still nothing is in error that she ever said.
I mean, I guess when you get that type of information, it is kind of hard to just let it slide and move on when there's so many questions that were left unanswered. So, Doug, when you hear this information, how do you start? Where do you start to put together a book, or let's say, it almost sounds like this could be a movie coming up in the future. How do you start putting this together? And do you start from the beginning, or do you start from where?
This was a particularly difficult project. When I had originally discussed this with our friend the Colonel, since I was in the motion picture and television business in those days, he suggested that perhaps it would be a movie. And my concern that was with this story is so complicated that you're certainly not going to tell it in 100 minutes.
Right.
At least at that stage of the development. We're talking about the story of Eva McClellan. We're talking about the story of Howard Hughes. We're talking about the story of a man named Werner Nicely who disappeared. And we're talking about the story of a man named Nick Nickley who appears out of nowhere with a cadre of aides who follow them around wherever they go. And trying to piece that together into one coherent story was difficult. I didn't know where to start except at the beginning. And so as the book progresses, we talk a little bit about the early life of Eva, the early life of Howard, the early life of Nick. But it really comes together when Eva one day, she's working at Howard Air Force Base in Panama when this tall stranger shows up and they meet. And that was really, from that perspective, then following the line of their life, sort of like the trunk of a tree. And then all of these other strange things branch off of it, but trying to do it in chronological order just to try and keep some sense of it. But yeah, it wasn't a particularly easy task.
So here's my question is, when you heard the stories of Eva, right? Eva? Yeah. So when you heard the stories of Eva and you start doing your own research, what was the first information that really stood out to you that really proved this theory that turned into reality? What was the first information that came across your lap and you said, wow, this we got something here?
It's a really strange little bit of information. Mark had all of this research he had done, and I mean hundreds and hundreds of pages. Eva was, she saved everything. She had receipts for the $5,000 diamond ring that Nick had bought her, which was just about what his salary would have been if he were indeed the guy he said he was at the time.
Right.
She had all these bits and pieces of paper, so I looked at all of that. Well, I did go through. Mark had done extensive research. I did a little bit of research on my own, and I was about 90% convinced that this was the real deal. I mean, it just, it's such a strange story. It's hard to really get your mind around it, but I'd gotten to the point where I said, I'm about 90% convinced. Well, then Mark and I went to Florida to meet with Eva, and there was one thing that had bothered me, and that was she had said that when they'd finally settled on their last piece of property, which was in Alabama, she said that periodically when he needed to communicate with people with some urgency, that a helicopter would come in and he would walk out to this helicopter and talk to the people. They lived out in the middle of nowhere. And then the helicopter would take off again. And I had a problem with that. I just couldn't believe that. And so when we met with Eva, I sort of politely but firmly kept poking at her about the helicopter story. And finally, she said, in fact, one day when they were coming in, they flew over real low and I was outside and they saw me and they laughed. I guess I wasn't supposed to see them or something. So I went and got my camera and I took a picture of the helicopter.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, okay. And then Mark and I, after we'd met with her, we walked out and Mark turned to me and said, I saw the picture of the helicopter. I said, really? He said, I saw the picture of the helicopter and I may have thrown it away.
Oh, no.
And so he went back to Nebraska and he called me 3 days later and he said, here it is. Here's the picture of the helicopter she was talking about. And so at that point I said, you know what? I can't really refute this anymore. There's just too much circumstantial evidence.
So, okay.
I want to know at what point she felt that this was Howard Hughes and not the guy she thought it was. At what point does she realize that?
Let me take that one because that's a great question. When they first met which was November of '69, and it was in Panama, she did not know who he was. He was a tall, handsome man, always had AIDS around him, always doing business. And then he left for about 2 months. He just disappeared, which is fairly common throughout their relationship, is one or the other one would just disappear. And then he came back. This was February of '70. He bought her a diamond ring in March. They were married in May. And she did not know, but she began to put the bits and pieces together. And he talked to her later about being married under a different name, which was kind of a strange thing to say to your wife. Mm-hmm. He asked her to sign everything for him. He would not sign anything. So after they were married, she signed everything for him. So she began to realize there's something really strange in here. And then she picked up several pieces along the way. But it wasn't until February of 75. They were living at a beach house in Florida at that point in time. It wasn't until February 75 that he revealed it to her. And she said, I already knew it by then. I already knew this guy was Howard Hughes. And after that, she could talk to him about anything. She said, why did you fly the Hercules? Why did you fly the Spruce Goose? She talked to him about his childhood, which was Howard Hughes's childhood. His dad was in the oil business. His parents died. He was an only child. He had very little education. He had probably about 8th grade education is all he had, but the man was a genius. And he didn't really need much more than that to be very successful.
So 6 years in,
She then at that
came
point
clean with her completely.
understood who he was.
Say that again.
So she then at that point understood who he was, and could ask him anything, and knew there's times when they would be alone in Alabama, and he'd give her a gun and say, if anyone comes close, just shoot him.
Wow.
Because he was very paranoid. She was very paranoid, especially as I spent time with her. She became very, very, she was very paranoid over that period of time because of the information that she knew that was so sensitive.
This falls into the category that behind every successful man, there's a woman with a gun.
Right. Right. Well, okay, the big question, the $100 question, could be $100,000 question, whatever you want to say, is why would he go from the most visible man in the world, billionaire, to go into hiding? Really, I mean, so why did he do that? Do you know?
Well, he didn't have a lot of choice at some point. If he wanted to live a peaceful life, it was pretty much out of the question. As he got older, I mean, the stories about him being, for example, afraid of germs, trying to stay away from crowds, things like that, those stories are all true. But he started kind of disappearing, separating himself from society in the late 40s, early 50s. And he was an amazing businessman, but he didn't always color inside the lines, shall we say. And because of that, he ended up in a position where he had a phenomenal number of lawsuits against him. He was in trouble with the Internal Revenue Service. If he had any sort of concept of a peaceful retirement, it wasn't going to happen as long as he was Howard Hughes. So the idea of bringing in a body double for him, and we know who the body doubles were, but the idea of bringing in a body double was essentially to throw people off his track so he could walk around. And I think that there is some evidence that one of the body doubles was shot, actually, and that it may have been that the fact the man was brain damaged, and that actually may have become an opportunity for Howard to say, to put that guy in as him, having everybody think that's him, and then he could just go off and live his own life without having process servers after him all the time.
And how do we know, or how do you know that that he did use body doubles? And you said you knew who they were. So how did you find out who they were, and who were they?
Well, I'll give you a couple of them. Let me give you my favorite part of the book.
Okay.
I love this. This happened beginning in 1972, 72 and 73. And it begins with Howard supposedly was living in, Howard was living in Nicaragua, and he wanted to travel to London. So the flight went from Nicaragua to Miami and then to London. When the aircraft landed in Miami, it was boarded by customs agents and Internal Revenue Service agents because Howard owed a ton of money. When they entered the aircraft, they found the long-haired, long-fingernailed, long-toenailed crazy guy. The customs agents and the IRS figured he was mentally incompetent. They let him go, and the aircraft continued on to London. While this is going on, the Nevada Governor, Mike O'Callahan, and Nevada Gaming Control Board Chairman Philip Hanlon had gotten word that Hughes was supposedly crazy, and he owned a fistful of Nevada gaming licenses. So the idea that all of these casinos were under the control of a madman didn't sit very well with them, and they demanded a face-to-face meeting in London. And so they went off to London, and now that meeting happened on March 18th, 1973. So it's 3 months after Hughes was on the aircraft as a complete mental and physical wreck. He then meets with the governor of Nevada and the chief gaming officer, and they say he's a commanding personality who knew exactly what was going on with his gambling properties. So that's kind of interesting.
That is.
A couple of weeks later, on March 21st, and then again on March 29th, the Howard Hughes in London decided that he was interested in some Hawker Siddeley aircraft. And so he decided he wanted to fly them. And so he arranged with his friend Jack Reel, he arranged to get 2 Hawker Siddeley turboprop aircrafts that he flew on March 21st, March 29th, with Hawker Siddeley's chief test pilot, a man by the name of Tony Blackman, who said that Hughes was perfectly normal and a first-class pilot. Okay, so not satisfied with the turboprop aircraft, he decided he wanted to fly a jet. On Sunday, June 10th, 1973, again with Blackman, Hughes flew a Hawker Siddeley jet aircraft. Well, then something really interesting happens. 2 weeks later, Howard, quote unquote, falls in the hotel room in London, and they have to call the house doctor. House doctor is a name by Dr. William Young, and he reported that the Howard in the London hotel room, that his skin had a parchment-like quality, emaciated, and he had fingernails and toenails. And just in case anybody didn't get the picture, he said that Howard looked like a malnourished prisoner of war. That was followed by a mental examination by a Dr. Robert Fowler, who determined that, quote unquote, Hughes was totally mentally incompetent. So in the space of 9 months, we have the Internal Revenue Service and the Customs Agency verifying that he's a long-haired, long-fingernailed incompetent. We have the governor of Nevada verifying that he's a perfectly swell guy and a first-class businessman. We have Tony Blackman of Hawker Siddeley Aviation saying he's a first-class pilot. And we have a medical doctor and a psychiatrist in London saying he's a completely emaciated physical wreck who is physically and mentally incompetent. That's all in 9 months.
Fascinating. If people like ourselves that we get to see documentaries, we don't get to hear the details of many of these documents from the officials that don't get made into the films because it's not as interesting to them. But people like us that are always seeking the truth, that's very fascinating. Well, for you guys that just tuning in, we have Mark Music and Doug Wellman. We are talking about their amazing book. It's called Boxes: The Secret Life of Howard Hughes. And we're going to take just a quick break. We have a commercial that we have to play. Got to pay our bills. But when we come back, we have more questions for you guys that are interested in this amazing life of the billionaire Howard Hughes. So don't go anywhere. This is Truth Be Told right here on Universal Broadcasting Network. I'm Tony Sweet. Got Captain Ron. We'll be right back. You suffer from anxiety, from depression, maybe even chronic pain? Well, listen up. Truth Be Told is going to tell you about a breakthrough program built on over 100 years of therapies used in America's returning veterans to help you successfully overcome PTSD, anxiety attacks, pain, and depression. The secret proven in study after study. Music therapy. The effects of music are nothing short of amazing. From strokes to PTSD, music has been shown to improve the quality of life. Now, one of the latest music therapy programs being used in America's veteran hospitals can be yours to experience for free at home and to help your own anxiety attacks, pain, and depression. Or just relax after a hard day. It's called Whole Tones. It takes music therapy to a new level. This revolutionary program makes use of specifically designed frequencies that have been shown to stimulate your body's natural healing power down to a cellular level. If it works for battle-scarred vets, can it work for you? Well, experience it for yourself for free at sweetwholetones.com. Like Tony Sweet, that's SWEET. Go to sweetwholetones.com. Now enjoy the show. All right, we're back. This is Truth Be Told, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm Tony Sweet. We have Captain Ron here. And you are listening to a great show with our new friends all the way from the Midwest and Utah. They have a book called Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes. We have Douglas Wellman and Mark Music. So Captain Ron had a question for you guys, and I think it's a pretty damn good question.
I did. I was wondering, when he passed away, wouldn't the wife have gotten $1 billion or whatever Hughes had? What happened to all the money?
That's absolutely true, and that is that's my second, maybe my second or third favorite story in the book. If you guys may have remembered that after the death of Hughes, there were something like 30 different wills presented. This all began with a will that became known as the Mormon Will. There was a man by the name of
Melvin Dumar.
Thank you, Melvin Dumar.
I was just going to ask you about Melvin Dumar because Melvin Dumar, you're from Utah, aren't you in Utah?
Yep.
That guy's from Utah, Melvin Dumar, isn't he not?
Yes, he is.
He's the hitchhiker, Tony, that in 1967 got picked up by Hughes.
Oh, really?
That's the other way around. Melvin picked him up.
That's what I mean, yeah.
And the guy he picked up, coincidentally, was near some mining properties that Hughes owned. But the Mormon Will story, and I'll try and make this fast, but it's a fascinating story, is the deal was Melvin Dumar, after the death of Hughes, says, hey, our will is found left at Mormon headquarters in Salt Lake. And the will says that Howard Hughes is leaving all of this money to various people, and Melvin Dumar being one of them, 1/16 of the estate. And when he's contacted, Dumar says, well, yeah, I picked up this old guy in the desert, and he said he was Howard Hughes, but I didn't really believe it. Well, the family, for all of the money involved, contested the will, and that really started a fascinating chain of events.
Number one, do you guys believe that story, by the way? Because there's some people don't believe that. Do you guys believe in the Melvin Dumar story?
I do now.
Okay.
I do now.
And I do also. I think it's exactly what happened. Melvin, of course, didn't get his day in court very well, but I think it's exactly what happened.
I always thought so. I did. I agree.
When Dumar was approached with the will, he told the story about picking up the old man in the desert. The family took this to court, and Noah Dietrich, who had worked with Hughes for years, he was defending the will, which in effect meant that he was defending Dumar, and they hired a private investigator who falls into our story in two different places. The word was that Howard Hughes had written a handwritten will, that he had given it to one of his operatives, a man named Levain Forsyth, and Forsyth was holding it for him until the event that Hughes died, and when he was supposed to get a coded message saying, deliver the will to Melvin Dumar in Willard, Utah. Okay. So when Jim Spiller was hired as the private investigator to trace this, he actually did trace Levain Forsyth from where he lived in the Northwest. He traced his tracks to Willard, Utah. He traced him to the gas station where Dumar had worked. And so there was an actual chain of that will going to Dumar. The problem was Melvin panicked when he didn't know what to do with it. And so he took the will up to Salt Lake City and then said he had never had possession of it. And that's really what got him in trouble. But when you look at the Mormon will, a couple levels here, one of the to get the answer to your question, one of the people mentioned in the Mormon will was a doctor who also received basically a lifetime appointment to the Hughes Medical Facility. And Mark and I believe that what was supposed to happen is that some of that money was supposed to be channeled back to Nick and Eva when they were then living in Alabama. The problem was the will was overturned largely because Dumar had, falsified whether or not he ever had it. So, yeah, we believe that's how some of the money was supposed to get back to them was through the doctor at the Medical Institute. One of the interesting things about the will, another interesting thing about the will, is that people contested the will as being Howard's because there were a lot of misspellings, bad grammar, things like that. And they said, Hughes was a genius. He couldn't possibly have written a will like that. Mm-hmm. Well, Harold Roden, who was the attorney who was defending the will, actually found documents that were handwritten by Hughes, something like 58 of them. And in those handwritten documents, they were filled with misspellings. They were filled with grammatical errors, and those grammatical errors actually match some of the very few documents that we have that were written by Nick Nickley.
Well, hold on one second there. Now, this will's from what, 1976, right? Because this is when Hughes would have died, but you're saying he lived another 25 years.
Right, and that will.
So how could his money be gone?
The money went to the family.
So then, what, Hughes didn't have it the last 25 years of his life?
That's correct.
Wow.
So he just pretty much decided to give
He
it
gave
all
away
up.
all his money, basically, if this is in fact true, that he would have.
Well, he didn't intend to quite give away all of it, but he ended up giving it. And Eva specifically asked him at one point, what happened to all your money? And he said, my family screwed me out of it. And what he meant by that was when they contested the will, they had actually, when they overturned the will, they actually overturned his ability to get that money.
Because Eva would have got her 1/16, and then he therefore would have been able to use that, right?
Well, yeah, Dumar, all of the people, the Boy Scouts were going to get some money. There were a lot of people who were going to get some money in that will. But we believe that the doctor who was going to work at the Hughes Medical Center, we believe that he was going to channel money down to them. But since the will was overturned, nobody got anything but the family.
Wow. That's incredible.
One of the other interesting things on that will was that aside from the handwriting matching Howard and Nick had always told Eva about he would only let her buy Papermate ballpoint pens. That was the only pen he would use. And when they were analyzing the Mormon will, the FBI analyzed it and determined that the will was written with a type of ink that was only available between 1960 and 1960. I can't remember the exact dates on that, but it was from a Papermate pen. And one of Hughes' executives testified that Hughes would only write with Papermate pens, and they bought them by the case.
Would he only use them once?
But just like Nick, it's the exact same thing, just like Nick.
Okay, well,
One other aspect of this that we learned after the first book came out, we had quite a few people come to us and give us additional information. And one other aspect of this is we learned that Bernard Nicely, Nick Nickley, was receiving medication and boxes from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and it was coming through the mail to them. And there's a gal who picked up their mail and gave us that information. So Howard is actually receiving medicine from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. We think probably because his hands were burned and his feet were burned from an aircraft accident in 1946, and these were helping his hands and his feet.
Okay, because of time's flying by, and this is this is great stuff. But I'm gonna ask a question. And Mark, you know, being a former major general in military, we're gonna ask you a few things about the some of these controversies that you're talking about. You know, from the Bugsy Siegel to the killers of President Kennedy. You know, being in the military, sometimes, I'm not saying you did, but you get access to some of the secrets and that information that we may not get to hear about. But both of you, tell us the links, because it says, you know, links to murders of mobster Bugsy Siegel and the killers of President John F. Kennedy. To this day, maybe not so Bugsy, but President Kennedy is always on somebody's mind. And who killed him, and how did Howard Hughes have a link to this?
Well, let me visit a little bit on the John F. Kennedy assassination.
Sure.
Howard told several people. Some was with Howard, some was with Nick, but the same person told several people that Frankie and Johnny were involved with the JFK assassination, and the same people that killed Jack Kennedy killed Robert Kennedy. And so we got that from several different sources, the same ones. And then we got information that Johnny was actually a mafia operative named Johnny Roselli. And Doug can talk about that a little bit, but there's a link here between Johnny Roselli and Howard in the 40s through one of his biological sons. So there's a link there in the 40s. And then as we proceed later on, of course, Howard had quite a mafia connection because he bought a lot of their hotels in Las Vegas in the 60s. And so there's quite a link there. What we've kind of found out is that the mafia was involved with the shooting. Wasn't really Lee Harvey Oswald or Sirhan on those two cases. But there was a mafia that actually pulled the trigger on both those gentlemen.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, Johnny Roselli was sort of the Las Vegas representative for Chicago mobster Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana and Roselli, going back to the Kennedy days, were in cahoots with the CIA over the Bay of Pigs invasion, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. And the CIA and the mafia were unhappy at Kennedy for the way he handled the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Roselli and Giancana were both implicated, but before they could really get too far with them, they each had unfortunate accidents. Before he was about to speak before the Senate Committee on Investigation on Assassinations, Johnny Roselli turned up in pieces floating in a 55-gallon drum off of the coast of Miami.
I guess that's the way to do it.
And Sam Giancana got shot to pieces in his kitchen. So neither of them were capable of testifying on those events. But so that was the connection, and we do have some information, you know, about how the mafia was quite likely the ones who did that particular piece of work. One of the other interesting things here, though, is that we've identified two people as being children of Hughes, a lady by the name of Cindy Hughes and a man by the name of John McDonald. The John McDonald story in itself is amazing. His grandfather worked for Howard Hughes, was president, I think, of Hughes Tool at one time. That's on one side of the family. On the other side of his family, his grandmother was married to a mobster, a Los Angeles mobster. So there's an interesting sort of events right there.
I'm going to show a picture. Is that McDonald?
Yeah, that's John McDonald on the right there. Yes, absolutely.
They do look.
Couldn't they DNA this though?
We do have, well, I'll give you one answer now, and we'll talk a little bit about it more. There supposedly is Howard Hughes DNA at a place called Intelligine in Texas, or Telegene, but they're not releasing it. So our DNA work has had to go sort of, over the river and through the woods, sort of, to try and put this together. But the man he thought was his father, was a gambler and a womanizer, and he owed a ton of money to the Los Angeles mob, to the point where he decided to join the army and go off and fight World War II because it would be safer. He owed a ton of money. After the war, as it turned out, he still owed the mob a lot of money, and the Los Angeles mob gave him the choice of paying him. I think he owed $25,000 at that point. The mobster, LA mob, was run by a guy named Jack Dragna. So the mob gave him the choice of paying the $25,000 they owed him, or he could kill Bugsy Siegel, or they'd kill him. So he got an old World War II surplus carbine. He killed Siegel, and then basically kind of had a post-traumatic episode. He murdered John's wife and then committed suicide. And then after the fact, they've discovered that Bob McDonald really wasn't John's father anyway, that John's mother had an affair with Howard Hughes. So Hughes was actually John's father. Then, to make everything even more interesting, he went to stay with his grandmother, who was married to the mobster, and their Sunday dinners would include people like mobster Jack Dragna, Johnny Roselli, who he's already mentioned, and Howard Hughes. So the connection with Hughes and the mafia and all of this stuff just goes all over the place.
Now, you said there's a daughter that you thought was alive too, right?
Yes.
Well, could you check the DNA between the son and the daughter and see if they're related?
Yeah, we did.
And they are. In
Mark
fact,
actually is the DNA guy, and we actually have something that just broke. So, Mark, maybe you want to?
No. Drum roll, please.
Yeah, Mark, you want to?
Okay, let's talk DNA for a little bit. If you have one of the same parents, you have right about a 50% match of DNA. And so we did DNA between a lady named Cindy, after we heard her story, we thought, I think she's legit. And so we did her DNA. After we heard John McDonald's story, we said, I think he's legit. And so we did those two together, and we come up with 8 out of 17 markers that matched, which is right at below 50%. And so those two, once you got that high of a match on their DNA, and once you listen to their stories, it's awful hard to refute that they're not the child of Howard Hughes.
Wow.
And so what we've got, but we don't have Howard Hughes's DNA. So we don't have that to compare it to. What has happened within the last week is, and this is still progressing, we're still moving forward on this and investigating it, but through Ancestry.com, it appears that there's a link between Cindy Davis Hughes to the Gano family. And the Gano family is Howard's mother's family.
Wow.
Howard's mother is Elaine Gano. And so now at this point in time, we haven't seen it officially, but it's moving in that direction, that there is a link now between Cindy
That's amazing.
and Howard's mother's family.
That is amazing. I'm a big fan of Ancestry.com, and I've done
There's
the DNA testing.
there's one
yeah.
other thing I just kind of like to interject here,
Sure.
and that is in the case of Cindy's family, her mother lived across the street from the Hughes aircraft facility in Houston, and the man who got her pregnant was a man named Howard, who was associated with the Hughes aircraft facility at what is now called Houston Hobby Airport.
So when you get this, this information, that must really excite you. Now it's going to be like, is it going to be a book 3? Because this is pretty good information. Listen, because the time is almost up, but I have to say this is what I love about history, because there's always something new, even though when you think you know everything about somebody or about a situation or about an event in history, this is when something.
And this
new.
One's a tangled web, man. Look at how
does.
many places
It does.
this goes.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Well, before we go, now, was there ever a connection with CIA and Howard Hughes? Because that was always talked about too, or FBI. Was he?
Oh, absolutely.
What was his connection?
And Mark can talk a little bit about this, but we think one of the primary connections was his constructing what became known as the Glomar Explorer. It was supposed to be a underwater mining ship, but in fact, that was a cover. It was built specifically for the CIA to raise a sunken Soviet submarine. And that happened right around the time that Howard became Nick. But Mark can really.
I think this is the ship here. I think.
Yeah. Hey, is that it?
I think so.
That looks like it. Yeah, there's a Soviet submarine that sank in 1968, and the CIA wanted it raised. And at this point in time, I think Howard had been involved with the CIA for decades prior to that. But they went to Howard and to go raise it. And so Howard says, okay, I'll go do it. I'll take the mission. And so he built the Glomar Explorer. Now, what we've run into, that is the exact same time that this Werner Nicely name came up. And so what we think he did, this is our speculation, but what we think he did is he said, I'll go raise that submarine and get that up for you. You give me another identity. And that's when the identity that he took was another CIA operative. And so those two things happened about the same time. At this point in time, this was the biggest mission the CIA had ever done. This was $350 million mission. There's probably more than that, but it's the biggest mission the CIA had ever done. They trusted Howard to do it, and he went and did it. And so I think that's just one aspect of what he did with the CIA. He also controlled the CIA's communication satellites.
Really?
So that he could use a phone linked into another person on another end with the phone, and therefore those communications could never be traced. And then we learned that he had his own communication satellites up there too. So that's why we read the books. Well, why couldn't they trace his phone communications? Because they were through his satellites, of which nobody was ever going to trace them. So he had links back to the CIA for a long time. We don't know exactly when it all started, but he was definitely involved with them in the 60s on.
So, do you think the helicopter that would come to visit, did you ever find out who that was, or do you think that might have been CIA or
we don't really know. One of the things that we came upon later, we have a woman, and she has to remain anonymous. We've quoted her in the book, but we can't use her name because, frankly, she's afraid of being identified.
Makes sense.
But she talked about mailing. Nick would write coded postcards, and she would mail them to various people. Over the years, he had us for a while, up until Hughes was officially dead. Nick had a staff of aides who would follow them around, and they would handle communications. After after the sort of official death of Hughes, they went away. But he would send coded postcards, and we're not quite sure exactly what all of this was about, but he was still communicating with people either in the Hughes organization or in the government, and doing it in a very strange way. But so far, we don't know what they were talking about or why.
And then also, let me add, as they were on the ranch, their 20 acres of wooded property out in Alabama, she also indicated that there would be visitors come and visit Nick. And they were Howard Hughes's people who would come and visit Nick, and this would be in the early 80s.
Well, I mean, it sounds like he wasn't completely broke, because buying the diamond ring, being able to buy a 20 acre. I mean, so it sounded like there was still somewhat of a money flow coming to him, maybe not to the
Off books.
Yeah,
This
off
is
books.
Yeah.
So somebody was still supplying him with money if it wasn't himself. So
The postal delivery person said that he would get something from a bank in New York every month.
yeah,
But obviously the letter carrier did not open it. So
right.
you know, it's just another interesting thing, since neither of them had a connection to New York.
Right. Well, I hate to even end it, but unfortunately we're out of time. But this has been such a fascinating story, and thank you guys for writing your book series, and this latest one, Boxes: The Secret Life of Howard Hughes, by Douglas Weller and Mark Music. And we hope you guys eventually, if you write any more books, will come back and have some more discussion with us, and right here on Truth Be Told.
Absolutely.
And you can go to Boxes. I'm gonna look at. What's your website? Boxes
HowardHughesSecrets.com.
Yeah, my eyes are starting to go. I have to like squint now. But
hey, thank you guys for having us. This has been
No.
a great show. I love the way you do the audio video thing. It's terrific.
Oh, anytime. Yeah, like I said, I'm a very visual person. So yeah, if it bores me, it's going to bore them. So but this is very fun, and I hope you guys come back. So thank you so much, and we're going to give you another applause because you guys deserve it after all that. All right. Thank you, guys. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks so much.
You got it. Well, we're going to go ahead and say our goodbyes for tonight. But what did you think?
Interesting stuff, man.
Learned some stuff.
There's so many things this guy's got in his life, though. There's so many channels you could spend a show on one aspect of it. You know?
I mean, he started in aviation, Spruce Goose, all these things. And like she even said, why did you do all this? You know, to me, what's fascinating is to get to the point to where now you're like, yeah, I don't want it anymore. Like I'm willing to give it up.
This is like the Elvis thing, or that they say he ducked out, those kind of things. Maybe somebody would get that famous in that. I don't know.
I mean, after a while, like us, we're, people won't leave us alone. All right, well, we're out, but stick around for another broadcast right after this of Truth Be Told. We did a series of interviews last weekend at Conscious Life Expo. We're going to run one of the shows, Mike Barra. You might know him, so from Ancient Aliens and his own work that you can go to, I think it's MikeBarra.com. But we hope you guys stick around. So I am Tony Sweet.
Captain Ron.
And you're listening to Truth Be Told right here on Fridays.
Good night.
UBN Radio. Take care. Bye.